So now to move on to the evening, and I'd like to introduce Professor Anne Roach from Flinders University. We're delighted to have secured Anne as a presenter tonight, as she has some fascinating research and work on alcohol and other drugs in construction. But before I formally introduce Anne, I'd also like to reinforce that the Charter now has a great alcohol and other drugs hub on the website, also where you can download on the AOD fact sheet that we released in April. So Professor Anne Roach is a director of the National Centre of Education and Training at the Addiction at Flinders University in Adelaide. Previously, Anne was the director of the Queensland Alcohol and Drug Research and Education Centre, and she has more than 25 years' experience in public health, and for the past 15 years focusing exclusively on alcohol and drug issues. She's worked as a temporary consultant in the World Health Organization, WHO, and has developed numerous education and resource materials, including an award-winning video and a comprehensive program designed for frontline workers dealing with drug and alcohol issues. So, Anne, we welcome you to the stage. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that sort of lengthy introduction and that very warm welcome. And I must say it's an absolute pleasure to be here to join with you in this fantastic initiative that's underway. It's incredibly impressive, and you've made an enormous amount of progress in quite a short period of time. So our appreciation for the work that you're doing always in New Zealand is shared with Australia, and you're often an exemplar for us in so many ways. What I'm going to do in this presentation, while you start to think up your difficult questions for me at the end, is to give you an overview of the work we've been doing in the alcohol and drug space for the last 15 to 20 years. And so I'll move through it a little bit quickly, and there's some slides I'll actually just kind of skip over just in the interests of time. But it'll give you an overview of what kind of data and research evidence is available to inform best practice and evidence-based practice in this area. And whenever we're dealing with alcohol and drugs, invariably people have views, whether it's your mum, your dad, your taxi driver, your doctor, whoever. People have views, they often have very strong views, and people often hold very judgmental and sometimes moralistic views in this area. And so what we want to do is help people navigate their way through, well, as best as we can ascertain what are the facts about this and how do we deal with issues that arise in the workplace from a non-judgmental, non-moralistic perspective. And our view is that what people are doing in their personal time is somewhat irrelevant to what happens in the workplace, so long as people are fit for work. And so it's important that we kind of put that up front, because not everybody that works in this space holds that kind of view, and much of the work that you might come across comes particularly from the United States, where the value judgments tend to be quite heavy. So what we're trying to deal with, what are the facts and what's in the best interest of workers, individual workers and workplaces, and the productivity of those places for the community overall. So I'm going to have to stand to the side a little bit so I can see my slides down the bottom here. So I'm the director of the National Centre for Education and Training on Addiction, and part of our work, certainly not all of it, but a stream of our work is in relation to the workplace, and that's some of our workplace team that you can see shown there. Centrally in that photograph is my deputy. We have a couple of deputies, but that's my deputy, Ken Pidd, who had spent 20 or 25 years of his life after he left school at about 15 and joined the Navy, became an electrician and worked on oil rigs and in mining and a whole variety of really unusual work sites across Australia, and was a union rep at one time. It's before he started to go to university when he was about 40. So he brings quite a on-the-ground perspective, and it's a very refreshing and helpful thing for us. The rest of our team, we tend to be kind of pointy-head academics and people who've come from the health sector, so you just have to forgive us. I'll talk you through, in a relatively short space of time, the work that we've done where we've looked at data that tells us what does the pattern and prevalence look like of risky alcohol use and also drug use in various workplaces by industry and occupation. What are some of those high-risk subgroups? What are some of the indicators of risk, so quantification of risk, the identification of risk factors? We want, and now what our work does is encourage you to think beyond looking at individual workers. We really want to encourage you to think about the workplace as an environment that actually might facilitate use and be conducive to use. And that's not the usual way that people come at this. We've also done some costings in terms of what the impost is in terms of alcohol and drug-related absenteeism. And in Australia, every 3 years, we run a really large nationally representative survey. And people are asked the question, so they self-report, in the last 3 months, have you had a day off work because of your drinking? Have you had a day off work because of your drug use? And have you had a day off work for any other health-related reason? So people self-report on these things, tends to be fairly reliable and quite helpful. We've pulled together this, 10 years or so of work that then we developed a cultural model, saying what are the controls, the contributors, the conditions in the workplace environment that create the culture around alcohol and drugs to inform interventions. And then we've run a series of interventions, and I'll talk you through those as well. We've also evaluated drug testing, in the sense is what does the available evidence tell us about its efficacy? Does it work or not? And what do we know about policy? So there's some of our key tools that we have available to us. So if you want to nod off for the rest of the session, you've really only got to think about these 4 things here, and I'll remind you at the end again. So the focus that we would take is that you really want to think about your workforce overall, and you want to think about your workplace. As I say, many workplace environments are actually facilitative and conducive to drug use, and there are things that we can do to alter that. So we're not really wanting to focus on the pointy end. There are a relatively smallish number of people who are dependent on either alcohol or drugs. As important, crucially important as that is to them and their families, what we want to focus on is the workforce overall, because that's where most of the problems and most of the impact on productivity and your profit will rely on that group, and I'll show you the data why that's the case. We also want to focus on managers and supervisors, because they're the pivot point. If you're wanting to intervene and make a difference, that's the group who can make a difference. The bottom-up approach of really providing sort of education and awareness for workers, it's nice, it's useful, it's good, but it's not going to get you very far. And we want to also think about young workers in that transition from school to work, when their behaviours are just starting to emerge and the workplace is actually shaping some of those behaviours and contributing to some of the problems. And I'm also going to suggest to you that drug testing has a role, may be useful. It's not the answer. It's not the sole answer. And over-reliance on it can be problematic in a whole variety of different ways.
This is an awareness test.
Can I go back? First of all, you have to watch this little video and do a test. So you can go.
This is an awareness test. How many passes does the team in white make?
Go!
The answer is 13. But did you see the moonwalking bear?
How many didn't see the bear the first time? And I got to tell you, the first time I saw that, I did not see the bear, and I could not believe it. So big, so conspicuous. Well, dealing with alcohol and drugs in the workplace is a little bit like that. You think, how can you not see this? And often people don't, and often at management level, you hit a brick wall, it's a blank space. And I've suggested to people, use this as a way to suggest to people that they might be missing some of the big picture around this, because when you start to drill into the data, the enormity of the problem that we deal with and the impact that it has on the bottom line and on safety is really substantial. So that's a helpful lever for us. So there's a couple of different ways to start to think about alcohol and drug use. So one is about the workforce use, like what do people in general use in terms of away from the workplace, and that's largely about the indirect relationship that it might have with safety and productivity. It's not to say it's not important. If you've got people turning up for work on a Monday who've been either drinking very heavily over the weekend or the night before, and they may not have a positive blood alcohol reading, but they may be heavily hungover and not fit for work, then it's an issue for the workplace. Similarly, if you've got people using illicit drugs, and much of it will occur recreationally over the weekend, and what they do in their own time is not the issue that we're focusing on, but if they turn up not fit for work, it certainly is. But there's another sector, another component to this, and that's about workplace use. And it's the issue about how much use occurs in the workplace and whether people are intoxicated at work. And I'll show you a little bit of the data on that. That's less of a common phenomenon, and over time that has become less common in many settings. But where it does occur, there's a legitimate role for policy to have views about whether it's appropriate or condoned and how it's going to be dealt with. So there's a couple of different ways of looking at this issue. The other thing that's quite important, and we refer to these affectionately as Thorley's balls, so it's a model that's been developed some time, that there tends to be an inclination for people to focus on dependence. So if you look at what the media talks about, it's the addict, and sort of many intervention programs focus on, that really severe pointy end that I referred to in that bottom circle down there. So here you're going to have a relatively small proportion of workers who may experience dependence, and dependence doesn't occur quickly. It usually occurs over a longish period of time. Some work from colleagues of mine at University of New South Wales have identified that it often takes about 18 years for problems to really develop and for people to get into treatment. 18 years of somebody with an emerging problem in the workforce can wreak havoc in a variety of different ways. So we're not really wanting to focus at that end. We're really wanting to pull back and say, what else happens? Problems around intoxication is probably going to be much more important for you. And that's another reason why drug testing may not be that helpful to you. So intoxication with either alcohol or illicit drugs or prescribed drugs. So the periodic use of those substances is important. And also problems of regular use. There's a variety of ways that can really impair somebody's functioning and have a series of different negative effects on them. So again, it's helpful to come at this in a couple of different directions, but not just look at the whole issue of dependence. It's way too narrow. In Australia, similarly with New Zealand, as I understand, that the majority of the population would consume alcohol, close to sort of 85-90% of the population. And in Australia, about 1 in 5 Australians would drink from time to time at what we would define as a risky level. So that might be weekly, but about a third would do so monthly or so, not that frequently. But the important thing here is that the research also shows, this is almost like an ad for drinking more often. The research shows that the less frequently you drink at a risky level, the more likely you are to experience an adverse outcome. And that's because you're not used to it. So the person who drinks quite a lot regularly has usually got some mechanisms in place. They've got ways to take themselves home after they've been drinking, that they avoid doing certain kind of risky things. They've got a higher level of tolerance, etc. The infrequent risky drinker will not have any of those strategies in place, and we know are more prone to adverse outcomes. So we also know that close to about 1 in 5 of our workforce also will use illicit drugs of some sort as well. And there's a high proportion who are going to be working under the influence of drugs or alcohol at any time. So bit of a difference again in terms of the drugs that people use outside of work hours, so mostly alcohol, high degree of cannabis use, increasing around drugs around use of drugs like ecstasy and methamphetamine. But painkillers are one of our big ticket emerging problems for us. During work hours, painkillers and analgesics are the sorts of things that are likely to be increasingly problematic. The thing that tends not to be tested for in drug testing, but can substantially impair somebody's ability to work effectively and function appropriately. So we know that there's a whole variety of different negative outcomes, potential negative outcomes in the workplace, and they can include the obvious sorts of things such as accidents involving injury and occasionally death, damage to equipment. But increased insurance costs and bad publicity, these are the sorts of things that really can impact on your business, but people aren't necessarily seeing it in that way. Again, sort of the dancing bear phenomenon. Increased levels of absenteeism, and I'll show you the data on absenteeism in a little while, and the impact that then has on lower levels of productivity. So it may be absenteeism, but occasionally it can be presenteeism as well. Subsequently, those things can impact on staff turnover when other people who are performing really well find that they're carrying a load for their co-workers and consider that to be an unfair thing and have enough of that. So it can impact in a whole variety of different ways. In terms of safety, the estimate is somewhere between 6 and 11% of workplace accidents are associated with alcohol. So that's a not insubstantial proportion of workplace accidents that are associated with alcohol use. We don't have good estimates for the impact of drugs. And we also know that productivity costs and the impost there is really substantial, so of the order of about $5 billion in terms of lost figures. And so you see the data there is from 2004-05 by some health economists, and we've done more recent analysis for the data from 2013 just in replacement salaries when people are taking days off work. So huge costs to all workplaces. So who are the workers that might be likely to incur most of these costs to us? So our data shows, and again, there would be no big surprises here, that males and young workers, the 17 to 29-year-old age group, are the ones that are most likely to be using both alcohol and drugs in risky ways. Certainly, by no stretch of the imagination, the only ones, but you have concentrations in those groups and amongst blue-collar trades. But that's not the total story by any means. When we analysed data more closely, and we did it by industry and occupational groups, you get a really strong differential pattern. So really high levels of consumption amongst agriculture, construction, manufacturing, mining, also hospitality, the place where most young people tend to get their first job. Also finance, some of the finance workers, and transport. And so apologies for those of you who don't like to read graphs and tables, so I've got a few of these and I'll try and minimise them and skip over some of them. So when we started to look and break down the data, our national data that we had, and so say, okay, where's the concentration here of risky drinkers? You can see by a long shot that dotted line is what the average is like across all workforces. And so mining, construction and manufacturing substantially above the average level. And when you get down to the right-hand end of that continuum for you, people who work in health, and then even more lower than that is people who work in education. Huge differences in the levels of risky drinking amongst the workforce. Then if we looked at it by occupation, again, you get that higher prevalence of risky drinking amongst trade people and unqualified workers. But hold on before you draw final conclusions about that. But we do know that you do get these important concentrations, and so elevated levels of risk in some areas. And similarly, when we looked at illicit drug use, you see a similar kind of pattern there. So hospitality, construction, manufacturing, again, see these are some of our high candidate workplace areas that we've looked at. And again, tradespersons are likely to be heavier users than some of the other occupational groups. So questions then arise about, and I'm going to drill into a little bit more detail, questions arise about, well, why might that be the case? Surely there's not going to be such huge differences in the individuals themselves. Maybe they self-select into those areas. Perhaps they do, perhaps they don't. Some of these workers are very, very young. And so the question then is, what is it about the workplace environment that, as I say, might be conducive to higher levels of alcohol use and drug use? So we also know that some of the workplace conditions are really important. If you work in a hot and dusty mining environment, and we've done studies and done work with numbers of mining industries in Australia, they say they're really concerned. So the very first kind of beverage that workers could get when they came up out of the mines was free beer and free alcohol, or extremely cheap and subsidised alcohol from the canteen, and they were worried and wondering why there was a problem, that there were no other cold beverages available. So just the physical working environment will make a really large difference. People working in shift work and working away from regular hours are certainly more vulnerable and more prone to the development of risky patterns of alcohol and drug use. And if you're involved with dangerous and stressful work, and those stresses can come in a whole variety of different guises for workers, and by the same token, if it's boring and monotonous, to alleviate that, some people will use alcohol or drugs as well. So we know there's lots of things about the working conditions that make a difference. On the reverse side of that, the workplace controls also will be influential in terms of whether there's risky levels of alcohol and drug use. And so if there's a policy that influences and makes it clear what this workplace says about how we view alcohol and drug use in this environment, what's acceptable and what's not acceptable, what might happen if any incidents arises, so long as that's clear. In the absence of that, in the absence of those controls, we have more problems. Where there's greater availability, and we show here that the hospitality industry, because one of our high-risk groups, availability of both alcohol and drugs is literally on tap in many instances. And visibility and supervision, so the visibility of workers and lack of supervision makes a huge difference in terms of what workers engage in, what kind of sort of risky behaviours in this regard. So some of the risks that might result from that, when we look at workplace customs and practices, it's the other C word for us, is that the ease of access on licensed premises, where there's staffies and celebrations that give clear condoning messages about, you know, how we use alcohol and drugs with our workplace, whether there's regular use that's condoned in, you know, often. And when I first started working, everybody in the university that I worked at, we all drank at lunchtime and often again at the end of the day. So it was how I learned to drink at a really young age, and what the expectations are from the rest of our peers that we work with. But there's a series of these protective factors, as I'll sort of cover in a few more moments as we go through. All of these things feed into what we think in terms of workplace norms and behaviours. Those things shape the behaviour. So it's not necessarily about the individual worker, it's about the workplace culture and what we collectively say goes and does and is not okay in our working environment. Externally, there's lots of factors. We know that when there's bikie gangs that come to town selling drugs, drug use is likely to go up. We know that when there are more drugs generally available and price goes down, drug use will go up. So there are certainly external things outside of the workplace as well, and there might be external stresses and pressures on individuals, so we're not discounting those. But together these things collectively produce for us a workplace culture, and it's a shared view about what's involved. And the stresses that workers and workplaces are subjected to are really important in that, as are the controls. So we want to balance those two things off. And there's lots of things that we can do to manipulate both of those component parts, both the stresses and the controls. I'm going to skip on. What we produced out of this was essentially this model that looked at the workplace conditions, the controls, and the customs and those external factors. And we said all of these things play a part in the manifestation, the result, the outcome of alcohol and drug use, and inform what we should be doing in terms of reducing risky levels of use and problematic behaviours. So that's in terms of that group. If I turn briefly to think about what about young workers? So the data will highlight young workers very quickly, and particularly in some occupational groups. So by age, the 20 to 29-year-old age group are going to always pretty much our heavy, risky alcohol users, and they're also our heavy, risky drug users as well. They're certainly the ones that we're of most concern with, but I would stress that those young workers who come to you are learning those behaviours about how to drink, what to drink, which drugs to use or not to use, and the workplace plays a pivotal role in influencing the behaviour of those young people. And in terms of gender, it's usually pretty much a 2-to-1 ratio of males to females. You're going to get more of the risky behaviour around alcohol and drugs with male workers than you are with female workers, as much as that might sort of even out in some particular places. The young workers, They're also vulnerable in a whole variety of ways in terms of occupational health risks. So they're likely to receive less training in terms of occupational health and safety, have less work experience, so that they're more cack-handed, more prone to sort of making errors and so forth, less aware of safety issues at work, and more likely to engage in a whole variety of risky behaviours. So young workers are very vulnerable and need probably some focused attention. Not that tip of the iceberg issue in terms of dependent people, but that young, vulnerable population. But regardless of whether the workers are younger or older, their alcohol and drug use can affect workplace outcomes in a whole variety of different ways. But the young workers, we think, and we've written quite a bit about this and produced resources in this regard, can have enormous impacts on the workplace itself. And I'm just going to skip over these slides here, probably because you don't want to look at too many graphs to start with, and in the interests of time. But the other key take-home message for us here is that when we look at the workforce and workplace, so separating those things out again, what is our main game? Our main game is really about alcohol. Many more harms and risks are going to derive in the workplace from workers' alcohol use than illicit drug use, simply because vastly more workers engage in risky alcohol use than drug use. So we tend to focus on the drugs because it's illegal and we get very agitated about that, but it really is alcohol. And the point that I was making earlier is that if you can follow this through, when we looked at alcohol-related absenteeism for 2013, that the very heavy drinkers certainly on a day-to-day basis take more days off, but there are very few of them relative to the light drinkers who are drinking less than 4 drinks in a session. So if you can see the data there, that on your right-hand side, 50% of the days off work are derived from those drinkers who drink less than 4 drinks in a session. It's counterintuitive. It's not what you'd expect. It's the lighter drinkers that incur most days off because there's simply so many of them. Okay? And the message there is that we need to be targeting we need to be targeting the workforce overall. We've also looked at the proportion of workers who are aware of policy in the Australian workforce. So most people are aware of policies, but we would argue that it's a comprehensive policy. And you can see there that policies varied. Was there any kind of policy? Did it only address use in the workplace? And most policies tend to be of that kind of nature. Did it provide some kind of assistance? Or was it a comprehensive policy? Now, what we would be recommending is that there be a comprehensive policy, and less than 10% of workers indicated that their workplace had a comprehensive policy. It's a very powerful strategy if it's done really well. And I'll skip all this for you here as well. So think carefully about the drug testing issue and the role that policies can play. Both policies are pivotal, absolutely crucial. Drug testing can be valuable in its place. And we've done 2 studies that I'll briefly speak through. The first case illustration is when we looked at that issue about what's happening with young people, young workers transiting from school into the work environment when they're learning how to drink and developing those behaviours around alcohol and illicit drug use. What is that can be done? And we did this with cooking students at TAFE, and we're now doing it with construction trainees in South Australia. And we spoke to them, they talked about their experiences, about the irregular hours that they worked, the amount of stress that they were under, the degree of bullying that occurred, the fact that they couldn't get a break often unless they took up smoking to have a smoko, that they'd lost all their friends from school or previous jobs because they finished at 3 a.m. in the morning, and by that stage they were being offered illicit drugs or alcohol with their workmates. So we knew that the work environment was really conducive to lots of problems for them. And so we ran programs with them, and we provided an intervention that really helped them to look at what are some of the stresses and strains they're going to be exposed to in their new job, to prepare them in advance for that. And we gave them some degree, session training doesn't usually work as a drug prevention strategy, but in this instance, preparing them to give them better communication skills so that they could communicate more effectively with their peers and supervisors was really important. We identified from work that we did earlier with them what are all the stresses in their work environment and help them identify ways that they could alleviate that stress that they knew that they were going to be exposed to. So we looked at stress management, workplace communication, and alcohol and drug-related harm, and helped them identify in advance strategies that would work for them. What we found was we got a reduction in risky drinking amongst this group, and they're kind of 18 to 20-year-olds, this group here, and we got a reduction in their approval of using cannabis at work. And we also got improvements in their ability to talk with their supervisors, beyond the grunt, as I call it, and their ability to deal with stress, which is crucially important for now and into the future as they mature as workers. So I'm good. 1 minute, okay, and an improved ability to deal with alcohol and drug issues. And the second case illustration is the one that we did with manufacturing. It was over 3 years. And in this instance, we did a needs analysis and say, okay, tell us about your working environment and the things that operate for you there. We did this across 4 sites, classic kind of, control style. We developed a whole policy package. We helped them to develop in the top left-hand corner, a meaningful policy and display it and make sure all workers knew about that policy. We also gave them, developed for them guides for resources if anybody needed help. And we embedded this as part of a health and wellbeing program. So it wasn't just sort of spot the alcoholic or deal with this. It was part of their supervisors being able to say, look, we're concerned about your health and wellbeing overall. This is just one part of a broader sweep. We developed a whole series of toolbox topics of which alcohol and drugs are embedded within those. And so it was, again, not singling out alcohol and drug issues. We ran short, half-hour, 40-minute employee awareness sessions, but long, 3-hour supervisor training sessions, because they're the gatekeepers and the pivot point in the whole exercise. Supporting your managers and your supervisors to develop and implement policy and to be able to work with their on-the-ground workers and talk about these issues was absolutely crucial. So, what did we get? We got a reduction in risky drinking. We got a reduction in the people saying they were coming to work with a hangover. We got a reduction in people reporting near misses due to somebody's alcohol work. We got an increase in employees' awareness of the policy and of employee assistance. So we were over the moon about this. But we also got improved communication skills, general improvements in awareness amongst supervisors in particular, and supervisors' confidence in their ability to be able to raise and talk about these issues with their workforce. And that's often the biggest stumbling block. People kind of know about it, they just don't know how, they don't have the set of words to have the conversation with their workers. Key take-home messages for you is have a policy, have a good and appropriate policy that's been worked out with the workers and with your unions, and it covers off, everybody knows about the policy that's in place. Take this whole of workplace approach. It involves everybody from the top down that's involved in any particular workplace environment, and involves some degree of employee education, but particularly the supervisor training, which is point number 3, and ensuring that there's referral mechanisms for support. Then there's a range of other things that could be done as well, but we would say that they're the add-ons. So coming back to my 4 key messages to you from the outset, it's the workforce overall that you really want to target for all of these reasons, not just focusing on somebody that might have a severe problem. And it's particularly young workers where there's great opportunities for now and into the future to make a big difference. It's focusing on managers and supervisors, more so than the frontline workers, and it's not drug testing is going to be the solution for you. Lots of our resources are available on our website that's there, and they're all available for download and for free, and you can contact us at any time if we can be any further assistance to you. So thank you so much for your time.